They wore crowns, issued laws, and claimed divine authority, yet ruled through terror, execution, and mass death. Their names were erased, softened, or deliberately forgotten. This is not the history you were taught. This is what power looked like when no one could stop it. Chapter 1. The king's history chose to forget. History is not a neutral record of the past. It is a filtered memory, shaped by victors, empires, and institutions that decide what deserves to be remembered, and what must be buried. Some rulers become universal symbols of evil, their names synonymous with atrocity. Others, equally brutal, fade into obscurity, softened by time or erased entirely. Modern history education often isolates brutality into the 20th century, framing mass violence as a modern deviation. Yet for most of human history, extreme cruelty was not an exception to power, it was one of its tools. Kings ruled without constitutions, without courts that could restrain them, and often without accountability. Violence was governance, fear was policy. The reputations of rulers were carefully managed even in their own lifetimes. Royal chroniclers justified massacres as necessary discipline. Religious authorities framed executions as divine justice. Colonial powers rewrote atrocities as progress. When empires collapsed, their records collapsed with them, or were selectively preserved. Some kings survived history by becoming legends rather than men. Others were absorbed into national myths, recast as defenders, reformers, or victims of circumstance. Their crimes were minimized, reframed, or excluded from classrooms altogether. What remained was a version of the past that was easier to defend and easier to forget. This silence is not accidental. Remembering brutality. Uncomfortable questions about power, legitimacy, and obedience. It challenges the idea that authority deserves loyalty simply because it wears a crown. To understand these forgotten kings is not to sensationalize them but to confront how easily violence becomes normalized when it wears the face of rule. Chapter 2. Vlad the Impaler, Terror as a Political Strategy. Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, ruled a small and unstable principality on the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe in the mid-15th century. Born in 1431, Vlad grew up surrounded by violence. As a child, he was held hostage at the Ottoman court, a political guarantee of his father's loyalty. The experience left a lasting mark, shaping his understanding of power, fear, and survival. When Vlad took the throne in 1456, Wallachia was plagued by internal betrayal and external threat. Nobles shifted allegiances freely, and Ottoman pressure was constant. Vlad responded by enforcing absolute obedience. His most infamous method, impalement, was not random cruelty but calculated intimidation. Victims were displayed publicly, often in large numbers, positioned along roads and city entrances. Contemporary sources, including German pamphlets and Ottoman chronicles, describe landscapes lined with corpses. This violence served a purpose. Crime dropped sharply. Noble resistance collapsed. Even Ottoman forces reportedly hesitated to advance after encountering fields of impaled prisoners near Targoviste in 1462. Vlad understood that terror could substitute for manpower in a weak state, yet his methods blurred any moral boundary. Thousands died under his rule, including political rivals, merchants, and suspected traitors. To later Romanian nationalists, Vlad became a symbol of resistance against Ottoman domination. To his contemporaries, he was a ruler who weaponized fear with relentless efficiency. Vlad's legacy rests uneasily between hero and executioner, proof that in fragile kingdoms, survival and savagery were often inseparable, and that political stability was sometimes purchased with unimaginable human cost. Chapter 3. King Leopold II, the king who never visited his killing fields. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium gained international recognition as the sovereign of the Congo Free State, a territory nearly 80 times the size of his own country. It was not a Belgian colony, but Leopold's personal possession, secured through diplomacy and deception. At the Berlin Conference, publicly, he promised humanitarian reform and the suppression of slavery. Privately, he constructed one of the most violent extractive regimes in modern history. The Congo Free State was organized entirely around profit, first ivory and later rubber. Villages were given impossible production quotas, enforced by the Force Publique, a colonial army composed of European officers and conscripted African soldiers. Failure to meet quotas resulted in systematic punishment, hostages taken, villages burned, and limbs amputated. To prove that bullets had not been wasted, missionary records, survivor testimonies, and photographs from the period confirm the scale of these abuses. Population loss was catastrophic, while exact figures remain debated. Modern historians estimate that between 8 and 10 million people died from violence, starvation, disease, and exhaustion between 1885 and 1908. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. Orders were issued from Brussels, through corporate agents and administrators who were rewarded for results, not restraint. For years, the brutality remained hidden behind propaganda portraying Leopold as a benevolent modernizer. Only sustained exposure by figures like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement forced international outrage. In 1908, control of the Congo was transferred to the Belgian state. Leopold died a wealthy king, largely unpunished, an enduring example of how distance, bureaucracy, and empire allowed mass violence to unfold without the ruler ever witnessing its consequences. Chapter 4. Ashurnasirpal II, when massacre was royal advertising. Ashurnasirpal II ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 883 to 859 BCE, presiding over one of the most aggressively expansionist states of the ancient world. His reign marked a turning point in how imperial power was enforced, not only through conquest, but through carefully publicized terror. Unlike later rulers who concealed their atrocities, Ashurnasirpal recorded his violence openly and proudly. Royal inscriptions from his palaces at Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, describe campaigns of systematic brutality. Rebellious cities were razed, prisoners were executed en masse. Some were flayed alive, their skins displayed on city walls. Others were impaled or burned. These accounts were not enemy propaganda, they were official state records, carved into stone and circulated as declarations of strength. The purpose was deterrence. Ashurnasirpal ruled over a vast and diverse population, held together not by shared identity, but by fear of reprisal. Violence was not chaotic, it was structured, ritualized, and selective. Cities that submitted were spared. Those that resisted were destroyed as examples. In this way, massacre became policy, and terror became a form of communication. Archaeological reliefs reinforce these written records, depicting executions, deportations, and tribute-bearing captives in precise detail. The message was unmistakable. Obedience ensured survival, defiance guaranteed annihilation. Under Ashurnasirpal, the Assyrian Empire expanded rapidly, securing trade routes and tribute. But this system required constant force to sustain it. His reign demonstrates how early empires normalized extreme cruelty as a tool of governance, and how state violence, when institutionalized, could be celebrated as royal achievement, rather than condemned as excess. Chapter 5. Ivan the Terrible, Paranoia on the Throne. Ivan IV of Russia was crowned in 1547 as the first ruler to officially take the title of Tsar. Legal codes were revised, administrative authority was centralized, and Russia expanded eastward. But by the 1560s, Ivan's rule transformed into one defined by suspicion, repression, and fear. Personal loss and political instability deepened his paranoia. The death of his wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560 convinced Ivan that he was by traitors. In response, he created the Oprichnina in 1565, a separate territory under his direct control, enforced by the Oprichniki, a state force loyal only to the Tsar. Dressed in black and operating outside the law, they carried out arrests, confiscations, and executions across Russia. The most infamous episode occurred in 1570, when Ivan accused the city of Novgorod of treason. Over several weeks, thousands were tortured and killed. Contemporary accounts describe mass drownings in the Volkhov River, executions, and widespread looting. Nobles, clergy, and civilians were all targeted. The city's economic and Political influence was permanently shattered. Ivan's violence extended into his own household. In 1581, during a heated confrontation, he struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, who later died from the injury. The act symbolized a reign consumed by distrust. By the time of Ivan's death in 1584, Russia was exhausted, depopulated in parts, and destabilized. His rule demonstrates how absolute authority, when combined with fear and isolation, can turn governance into a cycle of repression, devouring not only rivals, but the state itself. Chapter 6. Ranavalona I of Madagascar, a queen who ruled. Through death Ranavalona I ascended the throne of the kingdom of Madagascar in 1828 after the death of her husband, King Radama I. Her rise to power was secured through a violent purge of political rivals, including members of Radama's family and reformist elites. From the beginning, her rule was defined by isolation, coercion, and rigid control over society. Ranavalona rejected the European influence encouraged by her predecessor. Christianity was banned in 1835, and converts were subjected to imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. Traditional authority was reinforced through the widespread use of tangina, a trial by ordeal. Involving a toxic nut, accused individuals were forced to ingest the poison. Survival was interpreted as innocence, death as guilt. The practice, sanctioned by the crown, resulted in thousands of deaths each year. The queen relied heavily on fanampoana, a system of compulsory labor imposed on large segments of the population. Men, women, and children were conscripted for military campaigns, construction projects, and state production, often under lethal conditions. European observers and later historians estimate that Madagascar's population declined by as much as 1/3. During her reign, due to executions, forced labor, famine, and disease. Ranavalona ruled until her death in 1861, maintaining control through fear and ritual authority rather than reform or compromise. To her supporters, she was a defender of sovereignty against foreign domination. To her victims, she embodied a system where tradition and power merged into sustained state violence, demonstrating how resistance to change, when enforced through terror, can devastate an entire society. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Brutal Kings. Across different centuries, cultures, and continents, the most brutal kings shared striking similarities. Their violence was rarely impulsive. It emerged from systems of power that placed the ruler above law, accountability, and consequence. Monarchy concentrated authority in a single individual, turning personal fear, insecurity, or suspicion into state policy. Many of these rulers governed under constant threat. Fragile borders, rival elites, religious division, and rebellion were persistent realities. Rather than negotiate or decentralize authority, brutal kings often responded by escalating force. Violence became preventative, intended to discourage dissent before it formed. In this context, cruelty was not a breakdown of governance, it was governance. Divine entitlement also played a critical role. Kings were frequently presented as chosen by gods, ancestors, or destiny. This belief removed moral restraint. Executions became justice. Mass punishment became purification. When opposition could be framed as heresy or treason, extermination required no further justification. Paranoia intensified this cycle, surrounded by courtiers, generals, and advisors. With shifting loyalties, rulers often assumed betrayal was inevitable. Secret police, informant networks, and collective punishment followed. Entire families or cities could be destroyed to eliminate a perceived threat. Over time, fear isolated the ruler, reinforcing the belief that only terror ensures survival. Importantly, these patterns do not suggest madness in a clinical sense. They reveal how absolute power amplifies human flaws. In systems without restraint, insecurity becomes lethal, and suspicion becomes policy. Brutal kings were not anomalies in history. They were products of political structures that rewarded fear over trust. The question they leave behind is unsettling. When power is unchecked, does it create cruelty? Or simply give it permission to act without limit? Chapter 8. Why you were never taught these names. The absence of these rulers from mainstream history is not accidental. Historical memory is shaped less by scale of violence than by narrative convenience. Some figures are remembered because their crimes fit modern moral frameworks, or serve as warnings aligned with contemporary values. Others are forgotten because acknowledging them would complicate national identities, colonial legacies, or heroic myths. Education systems tend to favor simplified timelines and familiar archetypes: great reformers, noble kings, clear villains. Brutal monarchs who do not fit these categories are often minimized or omitted. Their stories challenge the idea that authority was stable, benevolent, or progressive. Teaching them requires confronting the reality that power was frequently maintained through terror, not consent. Colonial history plays a central role in this silence. European empires documented the violence of rival states while obscuring their own. Figures like King Leopold II were protected by language that reframed exploitation as development. When atrocities were finally acknowledged, responsibility was dispersed across systems, avoiding direct accountability at the top. In other cases, modern nations selectively rehabilitated violent rulers to serve present needs. Vlad III became a symbol of resistance. Ivan IV was recast as a state builder. Acknowledging the full scope of their brutality risked undermining national pride or political continuity. History, as it is taught, is not merely a record of what happened, it is a decision about what is emphasized and what is ignored. Forgetting these kings does not erase their impact. It only removes the opportunity to understand how violence becomes normalized when it is exercised by those in power, and why societies often choose comfort over confrontation when remembering their past. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Forgotten Cruelty. The rule of these kings did not end with their deaths. The systems they built, the trauma they inflicted, and the precedents they set continued long after their reigns collapsed. Borders were redrawn through violence. Populations were displaced or reduced. Political cultures shaped by fear learned to equate authority with punishment rather than protection. In regions ruled by terror, trust between ruler and subject eroded for generations. Institutions became tools of control instead of governance. Law served power, not justice. In some cases, the long-term instability that followed, civil conflict, weak state structures, cycles of repression, can be traced directly to rulers who governed through brutality rather than legitimacy. Forgetting these kings carries its own consequences. When violence is erased from memory, power appears cleaner than it was. Monarchy becomes romanticized, empire becomes abstract, the suffering of ordinary people is reduced to footnotes, while authority is preserved as tradition or destiny. Remembering these rulers is not about condemnation alone. It is about clarity. Their histories reveal how easily cruelty becomes normalized. When it is rewarded, justified, or ignored, they show that atrocity does not always announce itself as evil. Often, it presents itself as order, security, or necessity. These kings were not monsters outside of history. They were central to it. Their actions shaped nations, laws, and collective memory. To confront their legacy is to recognize a recurring truth: when power is absolute and unchecked, violence is rarely an accident. Not every crown represents greatness. Some exist as warnings, reminders of what happens when authority answers to nothing, and history chooses not to remember. Closing reflection and call to remember: history does not repeat itself by accident. It repeats when its darkest lessons are ignored, softened, or forgotten. The kings you've just heard about were not footnotes, they were architects of systems that rewarded fear, silence, and obedience. Their stories survive not to glorify cruelty, but to expose it. If understanding power means anything, it means remembering what it does when unchecked. This is Silent Scholars, where history is not polished, simplified, or made comfortable. If you believe the past should be confronted, not concealed, subscribe. Because the story's history hides are often the ones we need most.